Well, thank you very much. And I shall take you on a little journey now through 18th century anatomy. The useful bodies I'm talking about are bodies corporate, this society, other organisations active in London in the time, the bodies of individual surgeons who were fellows of this society, and body parts. And I do include some slides of body parts. So those of a nervous disposition, they're not the most gruesome body parts in my collection. But if you prefer not to see them, then please remove your glasses at the appropriate moment or stare at the lovely ceiling. I hope there's nothing in there which people will find upsetting. Now, to begin, in 1788, a correspondent to the European magazine reported the following news. Mr. John Hunter has recently opened his very curious, extensive and valuable museum at his house in Leicester Fields for the inspection of a considerable number of the literati, containing a novel and curious system of natural philosophy, being a very accurate and industrious collection of near 30 years. This curious museum was that of the surgeon and anatomist John Hunter, whose extraordinary collection of over 10,000 preparations of human and animal anatomy and pathology, plaster casts, sculpture, fossil shells, paintings, prints and drawings was housed in a purpose-built museum behind his home in Leicester Square, which he occupied with his wife, the poet Anne Hume Hunter, and their family. Now, what survives of John Hunter's museum is now displayed in the Hunterian Museum at the Royal College of Surgeons in Lincoln's Inn Fields. To modern eyes, it is indeed curious. It contains the bones of elephants and giraffes and the nests of field mice and bees. It contains electric fish and two-headed cows, the remains of prime ministers, archbishops and criminals. It includes paintings of Eskimos and Chinamen, cockerels with human teeth and testicles filled with mercury. So, my talk today is an attempt to persuade you this is not a cabinet of curiosities, but it is in fact one of many collections of this kind which played a very important role in the promotion of anatomy as a discipline in Georgian London. My talk focuses on 5 anatomists who are active in this time: John Hunter, Henry Watson, William Hewson, John Sheldon and John Heaviside, all of whom were fellows of this society and all shared a very similar career path. They weren't gentlemen by birth, they didn't have a university education, they worked their way up through society, and their election as fellows of the Royal Society was a mark of their social and professional ascendancy. That they should have done this is all the more remarkable because all of them were heavily involved in the practice of anatomy. They weren't theoreticians of anatomy, they were dissecting men, and they were part of a much broader culture of dissection in late 18th century London, in which students were encouraged to get their hands dirty, to dissect bodies, and it's this culture that informs their work. I think what also links them is their interest in collecting and building up museums of anatomy. The collections of preserved body parts, which were a necessary adjunct to the business of teaching. But these museums were not evidence of their complicity with grave robbers and body snatchers, but came to be seen as temples of virtuous endeavour. Through their museums, these anatomists were able to distance themselves from the noisome reality of dissection in Georgian London and fashion themselves into scientific gentlemen. And that's why their collections are so important. Now, these men were not the first to practice dissection or the first to connect it with the kind of rational, empirical, experimental investigation of the natural world that we've come to know as science, and which is inextricably linked with the work of this society. Yet their work did transform the study of practical anatomy from an occasional and rather contentious practice into one which was the sine qua non of medical education. Crucial to their success was their ability to translate their work from the private sphere of the dissecting room into a public sphere of polite discourse, to transcend the boundaries of the dissecting room. And one question we must pose, therefore, is what mechanism or mechanisms did they use to do this? As we shall see, their involvement in the Royal Society was an important facet of this process, but in contrast to some of their forebears, it was not the most crucial. while their affiliation with a useful body of scientific men helped anatomists such as John Hunter gain credibility, it was their interest in the collection and display of dissected corporeal fragments that helped fashion their corporate identity as virtuous members of Georgian society. Now, a brief mention of the earlier history of anatomy. The Royal Society played a very important role in the development of anatomy in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The work of Philip Wilson, Palmyra, Fontes da Costa, John Appleby has helped us understand the role of the Society in this period. And I think at that time, the first half of the 18th century, the Society really was the preeminent location for the dissemination of medical knowledge, Philosophical Transactions being the only major publication, certainly based in London, which was carrying medical reports. And if you look at the membership of the Society in this period, physicians and increasingly surgeons are consistently perhaps the largest single professional grouping within the Society throughout the 18th century. At least of the scientific members, that is. And the Society also held quite an important collection of anatomical objects, of which these are one of the few survivors. These are the Evelyn tables brought back by the diarist John Evelyn from Padua in Italy in the 1640s, showing dissections of the nerves, arteries and veins, presented to the Society at the end of the 17th century and part of the Society's repository until it was finally transferred to the British Museum in 1780. Now, the second half of the 18th century, I think, is a period of decline for the Society as a centre for anatomical research. It ceases to be quite as important. Other medical journals emerge, and they take over the role of publicising and disseminating case histories, medical reports. Although there are still papers in the Philosophical Transactions, they're not nearly as common or as important, I think, to the actual practice of medicine as they had been in the first half of the century. The loss of the repository to the British Museum robbed the Royal Society of any physical teaching collection it might use. And the Royal Society in the 18th century was not an active centre for the conduct of dissections, although the Society was entitled to receive bodies if it chose to perform dissections. As far as I know, it never exercised that right in the 18th century. So, in the second half of the 18th century, we have a situation in which the Society is important but not the prime location for the promotion of anatomy. But anatomists remain heavily involved, and none more so than John Hunter. The youngest of 10 children of a Lanarkshire family of decidedly modest means, John Hunter's prospects had been further damaged by the death of his father while he was still a child. Unlike his elder brothers, the young John Hunter lacked both the inclination and the opportunity to study. He never went to university. His brother later tried to persuade him to go to Oxford. I think he lasted a matter of weeks there, didn't find university education to his taste at all. But he did demonstrate a restless curiosity for the natural world, and this was to pervade his work and his career. In starting his career, John Hunter was heavily indebted to his elder brother William, who had travelled down to London and established himself in practice as a surgeon and later a man midwife, and who in 1746 had launched himself into a career as a teacher of anatomy in London. And William Hunter was one of the first to take advantage of the dissolution of the Company of Barber Surgeons in 1745, which released surgeons from their restrictive covenant not to practice dissection outside the company, and allowed people like William Hunter to start giving private courses of lectures in which dissection played a very important part. And William Hunter's advertisement said that his lectures would give gentlemen the opportunity of learning the art of dissecting in the same manner as at Paris. And what he meant by this was that his students would actually get to dissect a body themselves. They wouldn't just be watching somebody else dissect a body or just listening to lectures. They would actually engage in this hands-on anatomical education. Now, William Hunter was not alone. In fact, there were about 60 teachers of anatomy, surgery, midwifery active in London in the second half of the 18th century, all of whose work is predicated to greater or lesser extent on this practice of dissection. But William Hunter, I think, is one of the earliest and one of the best known and one of the most important. And so I think is a very good example. And although this Parisian manner was used by William Hunter in his adverts, really by the 1770s, this practice of student dissection was closely associated with London. London was the place that students came to get a practical anatomical education. Now, this is a kind of setting in which those dissections would have been performed. A small room, a group of men dissecting, not a grand lecture theatre. William Hunter and the other lecturers did give formal lectures, but the dissections were done elsewhere. And the students would be working on the bodies, and you can see here the bodies required for the courses. So 1, 2, 3 bodies on show here, a constant supply of cadavers needed to give all the students the chance to perform these dissections. And of course that brought with it its own problems, because these private teachers had no legitimate supply of bodies. They weren't entitled, as the Royal Society was, or the Company of Surgeons was, or the College of Physicians was, to bodies from executed criminals at the gallows at Tyburn or later Newgate. Instead, they had to make other arrangements, dealing with the resurrection men, grave robbers, body snatchers, buying bodies privately from hospitals, workhouses and prisons. Activities which weren't strictly illegal, but which nevertheless were not the kinds of things which surgeons wanted to be known for too closely. A kind of trade which had to be conducted with a degree of discretion, lest they invoke the rage of the mob. We shall hear later of one surgeon who did invoke the rage of the mob. So partly as a result of the difficulty in getting hold of bodies, all of these teachers made heavy use of what they called anatomical preparations, what we would nowadays call specimens, preserved body parts, dried bones, bits of dried and varnished tissue, specimens preserved in oil of turpentine or alcohol. And these are the things which they make out of their dissected bodies and they use in their lectures and demonstrations. And in fact, these things weren't simply substitutes for times when no body was available, but important things which could be an adjunct to the conduct of a dissection. And William Hunter told his students that they were to be convinced of anatomic truths by autopsy, by carrying out dissections, but by preparations also, as many parts cannot be shown on the recent subject. So the preparations were very important in allowing anatomists to preserve delicate or unusual structures, so they could use them again and again in their courses. Unlike bodies, of course, preparations were also quite useful because they could make the products of dissection visible outside the dissecting room. They could be taken to meetings, they could be presented and transported in ways that bodies could not. Therefore, museums of preparations, combined with other kinds of collectible object, played a very important role within the domestic arrangement of these private anatomy schools. And in this, as in much else, William Hunter was a pioneer, establishing a grand museum as part of his home-come anatomy school in Great Windmill Street. This is the exterior of William Hunter's school. A building designed, incidentally, by Robert Milne, who was also a fellow of the Royal Society, and John Hunter's brother-in-law. I'm not sure how that connects him to William Hunter, it's a bit complicated. But the building designed by Milne, I think, to William Hunter's design, became a kind of prototype for private anatomy schools and private anatomy museums throughout the late 18th century. And it was a model, I think, that was adopted elsewhere as well. And because these museums came to play an important role within these buildings, the making of preparations was a very valuable skill. John Hunter began his career as an assistant in William Hunter's dissecting room. Coming down from Scotland, 1748, no formal training, no medical education, starts work in the dissecting room straight away, helping to lay out the bodies for the courses, progressing to making dissections and making the preparations, the preserved body parts that William Hunter wanted to use. And it was John Hunter's skill in dissection and the manufacture of preparations that provided the foundation for his career. This is an example of a specimen made by John Hunter while he was working for his brother William. It's the epididymis from the testicle of a pig. It looks like a silver chain because it's been unravelled and injected with mercury. And the reason that's been done is to demonstrate to the students that what they're looking at is one long continuous vessel. It's an extraordinarily difficult kind of preparation to make. It requires a great deal of skill. And I think this lovely gilt frame it's in illustrates the degree to which Hunter himself, John Hunter himself, thought of it as a kind of masterpiece. And one thinks of his training in the dissecting room as a kind of apprenticeship. This is evidence of his progression in his career. As a result of this skill, John Hunter was encouraged by his brother to train as a surgeon, went on to work as a surgeon in the army in France and Portugal in the early 1760s, came back to London and established himself in practice. And John Hunter's ability to dissect, to make preparations, brought him to the attention of a number of other people, important medical and scientific patrons, who were either unwilling or unable to perform dissections themselves. Famous example, John Pringle, later president of the Royal Society, a physician, who said in a letter to his friend Albrecht von Haller that he had the weakness not to be able to see the dissection of a friend, and instead called upon John Hunter to perform post-mortems on his behalf. For Pringle, Hunter was that curious and most experienced anatomist with an excellent hand for the business. And among the post-mortems performed by Hunter for Pringle was that of James Douglas, the 14th Earl of Morton and President of the Royal Society. And John Hunter dissected Morton after he died in 1768. This is a bit of a former President of the Royal Society preserved now in our museum as evidence of the post-mortem. It wasn't just humans that Hunter was dissecting. Joseph Banks, another friend and a lifelong patron of John Hunter. This is a specimen which came to John Hunter from Banks. Lovely story. This is all that remains of a giant squid fished out of the Indian Ocean by Joseph Banks and Daniel Solander on the first Cook voyage. Thrilled they were to have hauled out this squid. The crew were thrilled too. Captain Cook notes in his diary that they made a wonderful soup of the squid. And all that was left to come back to London to be dissected by John Hunter were the inedible mouth parts now preserved in John Hunter's museum. Other examples of John Hunter's work, dissections of the amphibious bipes of John Ellis, described in a paper to the Royal Society in 1766, and again preserved in John Hunter's museum. John Hunter carried out dissections for Banks, for John Ellis, for Daniel Solander as well. Daniel Solander was one of John Hunter's proposers when Hunter was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1767, and to repay him, John kindly undertook the dissection of Daniel Solander after his death. So John Hunter dissected a number of Fellows of the Royal Society, I think, over the course of his career. We don't have any bits of Solander that I know of preserved in our museum. So this is John Hunter's career as a Fellow of the Royal Society, elected in 1767, and his certificate noted his skills in anatomy as one of the reasons for his election. He went on to become the Croonian lecturer between 1775 and 1782, the first surgeon to be invited to give the Croonian lectures, which had been started in 1738. John Hunter received the Copley Medal of the Society in 1787, a year in which he published 3 papers in the Philosophical Transactions. In total, he published 23 papers in the Phil Trans. And he was also, although he never held office within the Society, he was the informal chairman of a loose dining club of fellows who used to meet at Jack's and Slaughter's coffee house and I think engage in fairly long and rather drunken evenings, which started out as scientific discussions and tended to degenerate into something rather less formal over the course of the evening. So John Hunter had this wonderful network within the Royal Society. Richard Edgeworth records the informal dining club as follows. Without any formal name, its meetings for years continued to be frequented by men of real science and distinguished merit. John Hunter was our chairman, Sir Joseph Banks, Solander, Sir George Shuckburgh, Lord Mulgrave, Smeaton and Ramsden were among our members. So it wasn't a clique of medical men, it was much broader than that. And Hunter used his connections within the Royal Society to gain patronage, to gain patients, to gain things for his collection. And people like the instrument maker Jessie Ramsden actually designed instruments for John Hunter, a special thermometer for taking the internal temperature of trees. A very specialist application and one which proved to have no great market value, but something John Hunter was terribly interested in at the time. Now, Hunter wasn't alone as an anatomist involved in the society. This list is just to illustrate some of the other anatomists elected fellows of the society in the second half of the 18th century. And I won't run through them, but what's important to note is that almost all of them are surgeons, and almost all of them are active as teachers of anatomy in London. So the connection between anatomy teaching, the Royal Society, and these surgeons, men of a lower professional rank than physicians, making their way in the world, is quite important. The Royal Society, I think, became a very important venue for these surgeons wanting to gain greater status for themselves, and anatomy was one way in which they could do that. And the same is true in the list of Croonian lecturers. James Parsons, a physician, was the lecturer in 1750 and 51, Charles Morton, a physician, then John Hunter, the first surgeon in 1775. After that, it returns to a series of physicians, Samuel Fort Simmons, Edward Gray, George Fordyce, Gilbert Blaine, but they had all started out as students of John and William Hunter. They were physicians, but they'd been trained in anatomy. And in fact, the list of lecturers after John Hunter is effectively a list of graduates of John Hunter's school. So clearly, these anatomists exerted a great degree of authority over the Croonian lectures, one of the formal institutions of the society. And the list of lecturers reflects this ascendancy of surgeon anatomists in the second half of the 18th century. Now, the society, I think, played a crucial role for John Hunter in enabling him to make contacts within a much wider social and professional circle. Through the philosophical transactions, he was able to publish his work to a wider audience. But that wasn't the most important thing for him. His museum behind his house in Leicester Square, I think, was as, and probably more important, in terms of raising his public profile. This is a drawing of John Hunter's house. It shows the house on Leicester Square, where he lived with his wife and family, a second house at the back on what was then Castle Street, now Charing Cross Road, which contained the dissecting rooms and the students' bedrooms. A lovely letter from a student called James Williams, living in the bedroom, writing back to his sister in 1792. "In point of situation," he wrote, "my room is not the most pleasant. The dissecting room with half a dozen dead bodies in it is directly above, and the room in which Mr. Hunter makes his preparations is next door, so you may conceive it to be a little perfumed." Lying in bed, looking up at the ceiling. He went on, "There is at this moment a dead carcass rumbling up the stairs, and the resurrection men swearing most terribly. I am told this will be the case about 4 o'clock in the morning throughout the winter." So this is life in the dissecting rooms, this constant supply of dead bodies brought in under cover of darkness. In the contrast at the front, John Hunter's trying to maintain his reputation as a gentleman in his elegant townhouse. The museum, therefore, becomes a way of separating these two activities, but at the same time making the products of the dissecting room visible. And we know that John Hunter's museum was open not just to his students, but to a wider audience. Every Saturday in May, John Hunter opened his museum. 3 Saturdays for gentlemen, 1 Saturday for ladies, and would give people a tour around the collection to show them what he had. And of course, what he was showing them was the evidence for his research. These are examples of research for the Royal Society's Philosophical Transactions, an experiment on pig breeding, dissections of the torpedo and electric eel carried out for John Walsh in the 1770s, a specimen of a human stomach showing the autolytic changes, the digestion of the stomach after death, again published by John Hunter in the Philosophical Transactions with the encouragement of John Pringle, and a portion of skin showing smallpox. John Hunter also published a paper on the transmission of smallpox from the mother to the fetus while it was in the womb, and had a whole series of preparations illustrating his researches. And it wasn't just specimens in Hunter's museum. He also had a very large collection of paintings. These are just two of the paintings that survive. Omai, a figure also associated with the Royal Society, and Tan Che Kwa, a Chinese modeller associated with the Royal Academy. And Tan Che Kwa is featured in Zoffany's wonderful group portrait of the Royal Academicians, and was active in London in the early 1770s. So John Hunter mixed specimens with other kinds of object, and in that sense I think made them perhaps less threatening than they might otherwise have been. So Hunter's museum played a vital role in presenting these useful body parts to a wider audience. Because John Hunter's museum has survived in the Royal College of Surgeons of England, because William Hunter's collection survives in the Hunterian Museum and Art Gallery in Glasgow, more attention has been focused on them as collectors. But there were many others. William Hewson, for example, who had trained as a student with John and William, became John Hunter's successor in William's school after John Hunter resigned. A very able anatomist, taught anatomy privately after he finished his partnership with William Hunter, had a school in Craven Street, just off the Strand. Interestingly, William Hewson's reputation rested solely on his work as an anatomist and an anatomy teacher. He never actually practiced as a surgeon. But it was rewarded with the Copley Medal of the Royal Society, and with election a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1769 for his researches on the lymphatic systems of fishes and turtles. He also has a connection with Benjamin Franklin. The house which Hewson used to teach in is now Benjamin Franklin's house. Hewson moved in after Franklin moved out, and Hewson actually married Polly Stevenson, who was a friend of Benjamin Franklin. When they were conducting the refurbishment of Benjamin Franklin House, they actually discovered in the backyard a pit full of bones, human and animal bones, many of which had been injected with mercury, which were evidence of William Hewson's dissections. And sadly, these are some of the few surviving bits we know to have been dissected by William Hewson, because after he died, his collection passed first into the hands of his partner, a chap called Magnus Falconer, and then when Falconer died, the collection was dispersed by being sold at auction. So the entire collection was sold off in lots, in the same way as auctions of paintings or sculpture would be held. This is one of the specimens bought at that sale by John Hunter. It's a microscope slide, showing a little piece of tissue here in this hand-blown glass vial. And it was part of a series of about 300 slides which John Hunter bought as one of the lots at the auction. Now, among the buyers at the sale of Hewson's collection was another chap, of whom sadly no portrait survives, Henry Watson. Now, Henry Watson's career pretty much coincides with John Hunter's. He attended lectures by James Douglas in the 1740s, attended lectures by William Hunter in the same year that John Hunter started work with William, and his career shadows those of the Hunters. He was elected a surgeon to the Middlesex and the Westminster hospitals. He served as professor of anatomy at the Surgeons' Company in 1766, and again in the 1770s, and built up a very extensive museum of preparations, many of which were described in papers either read to the Royal Society, of which he was elected a Fellow in 1767, or to other medical societies in London. And like John Hunter, Henry Watson performed dissections for physicians who didn't fancy the idea of carrying out a dissection themselves. So this is a case published in the Phil Trans by Samuel Fort Simmons, a physician, describing Philip Kendall, a tallow chandler of Soho, who had a heart complaint. This is the appended paper by Henry Watson describing the post-mortem. And this is the drawing of Philip Kendall's heart, which was published and which then entered Henry Watson's collection. And we shall return to Philip Kendall's heart at the end of the talk. Watson also carried out dissections of animals, dissecting the Gillaroo trout for the judge, antiquary and naturalist Thames Barrington. John Hunter also dissected trout for Barrington, and this is a bit of trout from John Hunter's collection. Sadly, none of Watson's trout preparations have survived. And there seems to have been quite a competition between John Hunter and Henry Watson to get hold of the best preparations. So they seem to have competed against each other at auctions and also in competing to receive things from surgeons sending specimens into London from outside. Another surgeon who bought at the sale of Hewson's collection was John Sheldon, again a student of the Hunters, and a rather interesting figure. He had a successful career as initially a surgeon and an anatomy teacher, and at one stage he looked to be serious competition to the Hunters when he set up his own anatomy school in Great Queen Street, near the northwest corner of Lincoln's Inn Fields. Amongst the things which he taught his students was the art of dissecting, injecting and making anatomical preparations. So as well as actually teaching his students how to dissect, he taught them how to make these preserved specimens so they could build up their own collections as they started work. He enjoyed considerable success, and his skill was reflected in his museum. He bolstered his collection by judicious purchase. So amongst the items he purchased at the Hewson sale were all of those preparations of the lymphatic system for which Hewson was awarded the Copley Medal. So Sheldon kind of appropriated Hewson's work into his own museum. And he also acquired a lot of specimens from another Fellow of the Royal Society and anatomy teacher, the surgeon Percival Pott, many of which were figured in Pott's work on paralysis of the lower limbs, a study which gave rise to the spinal disease, which still bears Pott's name. However, I think the most interesting connection between Sheldon and the Royal Society was his adventures as a balloonist, which were entirely, or not entirely, unrelated to his interests as an anatomist. In 1783, Sheldon was elected Professor of Anatomy at the Royal Academy, and the following year he embarked on a voyage with the French aeronaut Jean Blanchard for the first balloon flight in England. This is the title page of the chronicle of their journey, which was not entirely without incident, it has to be said. The idea was that Sheldon would have a cage full of pigeons, which he would take aloft with him, and while aloft he would dissect the pigeons to see whether there was any change to their internal structure as a result of the altitude. Why he couldn't have gone up a hill, which would have been much easier, I don't know. But anyway, this is what he wanted to do. Blanchard, I think, was slightly dismayed at the amount of apparatus that Sheldon had brought with him for the voyage. And he records in his diary how it was evident that the balloon was never going to get off the ground with all this stuff that Sheldon had. So they ditched a lot of the stuff before they took off. As they drifted lower and lower across London, Blanchard started to heave out the rest of Sheldon's preparations and specimens and instruments, which included musical instruments, a French horn. Why? In-flight entertainment, I don't know what it was for. But anyway, it got to the point when the only things left in the balloon were Blanchard and Sheldon. And at that point, Blanchard, I think, started looking at Sheldon in a rather funny way. And the next time they touched ground, Sheldon made a quick exit and didn't return aloft. That was an interlude, however, from his work as an anatomist. However, he does seem to have had a taste for adventure. And the year after the balloon adventure, he was commissioned by John Hunter to go on a different kind of voyage, travelling with one of the Greenland whalers to see if he could pick up some specimens of whales for John Hunter's collection. And John Hunter records what happened as a result of this in a paper, again in the Philosophical Transactions, on the anatomy of whales. As the opportunities of ascertaining the anatomical structure of large marine animals are generally accidental, and being anxious to get more extensive information, I engaged a surgeon, Sheldon, at considerable expense to make a voyage to Greenland. But the only return I received was a piece of whale's skin with some small animals sticking upon it. This is all that John Hunter got back from Sheldon as a result of the voyage, and it seemed rather an expensive business to go to for one small bit of whale skin with some barnacles on it. I don't know whether these facts are connected, but soon after Sheldon succumbed to depression, he resigned his work as a teacher. He moved down to Exeter, where he lived out the rest of his life, rarely returning to London. As he gave up his teaching work, his collection also was sold off at auction. So like all these other collections, it ended up being dispersed and sold, and very few of the specimens can now be traced. Now, my final anatomical fellow, shown here in an engraving after an original portrait by William Beechey, is a rather different character. The son of a wealthy Hertfordshire surgeon also called John Heaviside. Heaviside served an apprenticeship to Percival Pott and attended the lectures of John Hunter. But in contrast to the other figures I've mentioned, Heaviside never worked as a teacher of anatomy. Instead, he built his entire career around the purchase of other collectors' museums and their incorporation into his own museum. So his entire reputation was based upon a museum which he played rather little part in actually assembling, other than by buying things from other people. He bought lots of individual specimens at auction sales, but in 1793 he transformed his collection to stroke by buying the entire collection of Henry Watson, who I mentioned earlier. So Heaviside purchased the entire collection of Henry Watson and used that as the basis for a rather grand new museum. And this rather naked opportunism earned him more than a little sniping from some of his colleagues. William Clift, who was one of John Hunter's assistants, noted that many of the descriptions attached to the specimens in Heaviside's museum were generally vague and pompous, and occasionally bordering on the marvellous, apparently unintentionally. So the lack of anatomical expertise that Heaviside had, Clift suggested, affected his ability to actually describe these things in his collection. And another anonymous wit suggested that Heaviside's habit of appropriating the work of others be memorialised on his gravestone as follows. Beneath, well encased, a body is placed, which Heaviside claimed as his own, who sung the Te Deum when he bought the museum of Watson to science well known. So by buying this collection, Heaviside seems to have brought himself into some disrepute with his peers, but nevertheless he gained a degree of credibility as a result. And this wonderful, this is a coloured engraving after an original by Johann Zoffany of John Heaviside, shows him with two specimens, and crucially, they're borrowed specimens. This is a specimen showing Pott's disease of the spine, probably acquired either through Sheldon or through Henry Watson. And the thing which he holds proprietorially in his hand is, of course, the heart of Philip Kendall, described in the paper to the Philosophical Transactions some decades before. And in choosing to be memorialised this way with two important specimens which were nothing to do with him, other than the fact he'd had the judgment to buy them when they came up for sale, I think Heaviside reveals himself as the arch appropriator of other people's museums. And his museum became a very important part of his work. Sorry, this is just the heart again. This is the interior of Heaviside's museum, so a rather grand space. It's one of the few surviving illustrations of the interior of an 18th century anatomy museum. And we know that Heaviside gave regular soirees, inviting people into his museum. And it was actually described in some of the visitors' guides to London as one of the things to do on a Friday evening. If you're at a loose end, then you can go along to Heaviside's museum, and he'd provide refreshments for his visitors. So he'd provide tea and coffee and things. And it was later said of him that with coffee, tea and buttered rolls, he found an easy way to people's souls. Eventually, I think the expense of providing refreshments proved too much, and he stopped that, but he did allow people to come in and have a look at the museum. So it was a way of showing off what he was doing to a wider audience. It became a very important thing. And he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, not for any great contributions of his own, but simply, I think, because of his reputation as the owner of these other collections. And I think Heaviside's case neatly encapsulates the importance of the Anatomy Museum and its serried ranks of useful parts to the shaping of the identity of Georgian anatomists. Just as we can see in these preparations the distilled lives of the dissected individual, so too we can see in them the spirit of those who made and owned them, who transformed them into objects of interest and study. Yet this was not an idle or fickle curiosity or a morbid or macabre interest. In these varnished tissues, dried bones, wet specimens, the anatomists preserved the records of their work and made them accessible to a much wider audience than might otherwise have been possible. In the history of natural philosophy, experimental natural philosophy in the 17th and early 18th century, much attention has been paid to the work of showmen, to giving demonstrations of physical phenomena using experimental apparatus, air pumps, for example. And I think specimens, preparations, are the anatomist's equivalent of these demonstration apparatuses. These are things which they can use to make their work visible to a much wider audience and to make a business which is rather unpleasant and disgusting, dissection of a human body or an animal body, presentable to a polite audience. Through their researches, these anatomists achieved, I think, quite astonishing professional success, and their election to the Society and the contributions they made to its work, to the philosophical transactions, are a measure of this, and they certainly helped to advance their careers through the Society. But their museums were an important element of their social success by displaying this physical evidence of their work to both medical and non-medical audiences. Their collections reflected their ambitions and adventures, and it's precisely this ability to move from material which might otherwise be rather unpleasant to think about wider issues that makes the museum so important. It's been said of John Hunter that he made surgeons into scientists and gentlemen. And if so, it was in the museum rather than the meeting room or the dissecting room that this transformation took place. Thank you very much.